Welcome to the Gamut of Performance Podcast, episode 32. On this episode of the podcast, I get to talk with Dr. Pat Davidson. Pat is a bit of a renaissance man and has done work with strongman, MMA, as well as in the private sector, to name a few. In this conversation, Pat and I dive into a diverse subject matter, so without further ado, here is Dr. Pat Davidson. Pat, thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to getting you on here and hearing some of your ideas and some of the things you're working on. So for the listeners at home, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and where you are currently?
Sure. So I guess, just to stick to as close as I can, like in terms of giving a quick description that doesn't ramble on too long. I would say that I would define myself as like someone that's just kind of like a former jock or like a failed athlete in a lot of ways. And, I think a lot of guys that end up getting into strength and conditioning or performance-oriented sports science tend to be from that mold. And, I was, in high school, football and baseball. And, after high school, I played some college baseball. And then after that, I got into mixed martial arts. And, it was always like, in baseball, the thing that always held me back was the 40 and 60 time. And it was always like, trying to figure out anything I could possibly do to get myself to run a faster time at those distances. It seemed as though no matter what I tried to do, I couldn't crack that code. And then ultimately, after baseball finished up, like getting into mixed martial arts and submission wrestling type stuff, it was an interesting transition because it was the first time I had done a sport that involved a significant amount of conditioning, number one. Okay. And number two involved weight classes and manipulating body weight through diet, which was kind of like, I like the first time you get into that, this would have been the late 90s too. Like there just wasn't as much of a scene in terms of like strength and conditioning, high level training. Like, on Instagram nowadays, you see people doing all kinds of like legitimate training from strongman to Olympic lifting to whatever, it just none of that stuff existed. Like there were some bodybuilding shows and that was about it. So it was, for me, like the exposure to manipulating the body kind of came just as a result of the things that I got into. I got into lifting weights because I originally wanted to be the highest level baseball player I could. And it was, kind of at a time where you saw the best baseball players looking like bodybuilders. I think we were all fairly unaware of the steroid culture involved with baseball, but my brain just put one and one together to make two. Like if you want to be a Major League Baseball player, you got to be jacked. So how do you get jacked? Well, you do what these bodybuilders do. And then getting into mixed martial arts, as I was saying, where body weight actually can make a significant difference in terms of your ability to compete at a very high level. That was a cool experience to go to in terms of like actually being able to numerically see my body weight change dramatically and bring it down to some very low levels and compete at a high level, largely because I could just be like stronger than other humans at like 154 pounds and what kind of an advantage that was.
No, that makes sense.
I can remember like at that time, like my undergraduate degree was in history, and my mixed martial arts coach was kind of like, what are you going to do ultimately career-wise? And I was thinking like I'd probably be a high school history teacher. It was a tough time at that point, like right around 2004, to try to do that because there was a hiring freeze. There were a lot of like economical problems and government economic problems that were a factor. And he was kind of like, why don't you go down the road of actually studying and making a career of something related to fitness, like just based on the fact that like, you love to train, you love this stuff, you study the science around it already, like, it seems to be a good fit for you. And it was kind of like I like the most obvious thing in the world when he said it, but prior to that, I hadn't really considered it, to tell you the truth. Mainly because I just never really heard of someone being a strength and conditioning coach or or anything remotely like that.
Yeah.
So, I started pursuing it, and I found that I just really enjoyed studying the material.
Yeah.
And then I was actually pretty good at it. Like, once I found a subject, I was decent in school with history and that kind of stuff, but I didn't really have the same obsessive passion towards learning it as I did when all of a sudden I found like, hey, I can learn the science behind how my body works and how training is capable of manipulating that.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, this is like there's so much upside here. Like, I can get good grades, which feels good.
Mm-hmm.
I can learn how to physically change my own body to make myself a better competitor in the sport I like.
Yeah.
And and I like it. So it was just kind of like I just kind of kept that ball rolling, and eventually finished a master's program in strength and conditioning, and then I got a PhD in exercise physiology. And from there, I started working in university settings. I worked at Brooklyn College, and I worked at Springfield College, and I really enjoyed the part of the job in terms of like interacting with students and and trying to really teach this material in an interactive way and get kids excited about what they could potentially do with this information and how they could really influence their careers and make whatever kind of life they wanted to out of this stuff.
Yeah.
So from there, eventually I got a very interesting job offer in New York City that ultimately kind of didn't pan out the way that I hoped it would. And it's been fine though, because now I sort of have my own business in New York City as I train people in the city, and I'm getting a chance to launch a group fitness concept in New York City that'll involve Kaiser equipment and numerically displaying kind of like a summed power score for people being able to go through different workouts.
Okay.
So that's kind of where I'm at now, and I at this point in time I teach weekly education sessions at the gym I'm at, Hype Gym.
Yeah. And
I teach the seminar Rethinking the Big Patterns that I put together. Taught that around the country. I've written Mass and Mass 2, and hopefully write Mass 3 at some point this year. But yeah, I would say that like my overall what I'm doing these days is trying to start a new conceptual business, author books, present, and train and coach athletes and regular people.
I love it. And that will you touch a little bit on your PhD process and what you liked about the program and what you disliked and some of the things you were able to learn there?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's a good question. I chose to go to Springfield College because there was a woman who was a professor at where I got my master's degree, and she had gotten her PhD at Springfield College.
Okay.
And she was just like the coolest person I had ever met. She started a strength and conditioning master's program at that school. She was a competitor in Olympic-style weightlifting. She was just a phenomenal athlete overall.
Yeah.
Incredibly charismatic and engaging professor, and made us all feel like kind of like a tight-knit little family or community in that strength and conditioning program. And I basically just wanted to be her. That's like, the extent of my ambition was like, I want to be just like Dr. Robinson. And I was like, well, how do I do that? Like, well, I'll just try to follow in her footsteps. So, when I went to Springfield College for my interview for the program, Dr. Pallone, who ran the program there, he was asking me the typical questions, and I kind of know what those questions are now after the fact, but I had no idea what I was getting into, where he was asking me, like, what's your research interest? And I was like, I don't have one, I don't know.
Hindsight's 20/20, right?
Yeah, like, it's unbelievable. I was so, like totally ignorant of what academia at that level is really all about.
Yeah.
But, he was like, well, you better figure that out. And I was like, well, why do I need to figure that out?
Yeah.
He was like, well, you're going to have to write a dissertation on something. And I was like, well, okay, I'll do that when the time comes.
Yeah.
He's like, why do you want to come here? And I was like, well, Dr. Robinson got her PhD here. And he's like, oh, yeah, Ellen, I remember her. And he was like, well, why else? Like, what specifically about? I was like, I nothing else. That's the only reason. Like, so he was just like, this is a strange interview. This is one of the more odd ones I've had. And I was like, no, it's fine. You know, I was like, well, you know, I should be able to get in here, right? Mm-hmm. Like my GRE scores meet your criteria. My GPA meets your criteria. He's like, oh yeah, I mean, your scores are phenomenal. Like, you're going to be in here. Like, numerically, we can't even deny you. And I was like, all right, cool. He's like, do you want a tour of the facilities? And I was like, no, not really. Like, so, like, that was really the extent, like, for me. And I was like, you know, honestly, like, the only place I want to check out is like the strength and conditioning weight room. And he's like, why do you want to see that? Like, I was like, well, I compete in Olympic style weightlifting. I'm going to want to use a platform somewhere. Mm-hmm. And also I usually like to hang out with strength coaches. Yeah. And he was like, yeah, you know, they're not in the same program as you. I was like, yeah, I totally know that. Like, he's like, all right, fine. It's like, ask Dr. Jones. She'll know where that is. Yeah. So he sent me down the hall to Margaret Jones, and I like introduced myself, and I was like, hey, you know, so it was just like the most backwards interview imaginable. And
no, I can only imagine. Yeah, I can only imagine what they were going through, you know?
Yeah, it was really funny.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
But yeah, once I got there, you know, the only thing I really said to myself was, like, I'm a competitive person, and I was just like, you know, I'm gonna just take this one class at a time, and I'm gonna try to leave a lasting impression on this school that, like, no one ever came here and worked harder and got better scores on things. Yeah. And that's really what I tried to do. Like, I just tried to compete with every other student as hard as I possibly could on every exam, every paper, everything that could possibly be graded. And, you know, it worked out. Like, I figured out the thing as I went along, and I've taken that approach to a lot of things in life. Like, you know, I had no real business experience before deciding, you know, I think I'm going to try to create a new business concept. You just figure it out as you go. You know, it's kind of like that ready, fire, aim concept. You know, so many people wait for things to be perfect and then they don't do anything.
Yeah, no, that's a huge concept,
Sometimes you just got to start doing stuff in life. Yeah. And when you start making mistakes, you realize that you made a mistake and you go about working hard and correcting it and not making that same mistake again.
No, I like that. And so touching on that competitive nature of yours, right? So you work with athletes and you work with a lot of strength coaches that do work with athletes. So what's your opinion on a lot of sport coaches, right? They like to come into the weight room, right, and they want strength coaches to do something competitive in, say, every session, right? Do you think that does any benefit? Does that have any kind of transfer to the actual sport, or is that just kind of wasted time and taken away from training?
I think that there's very few times where it should be super competitive. You know, it's kind of like, well, first of all, like you know, I think I think people that work in the field understand, like, hey, not all athletes are very skilled in terms of fitness. You know, like, there's a lot of teaching that has to be done with them to be able to get them to execute the movements, even remotely close to correct. You know, their attention span for learning these things isn't as high as it should be. So you see a lot of real, like, junky crap even at the highest level of strength and conditioning with pro athletes. You know, it's like you get a lot of these people, like, worried about, like, technology and GPS and all this, and it's like, well, can we get the guys to at least do a halfway decent squat? Like, I don't even, you know, like, there's some real low hanging fruit here.
We got to pass the eye test.
So it's like, when you're talking about making it competitive, it's kind of like, I can remember the strength coach Leanne Glynn, who was at Arizona State.
I actually worked for her. Yeah, she was my boss last year.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I remember something she said that I heard her say in, I think, 2004, where, you know, like, I think we were talking about maybe, like, West Side methods or something like that, and she said, you know, 60% of shit is shit. And
that sounds like her.
Well, that's right. Like, if you know her, you're like, oh yeah, that sounds like exactly something she'd say. But it's kind of like, what competition? Are you kidding me? Like, they can't do anything right in the first place. So, but at the same time, like with athletes, they are driven by competition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like that's how you actually are capable of bringing out the best in them. So introducing it from time to time is great, but if it's always competition, now you got the same problems as CrossFit, where people are trying to go out of their bodies and out of their minds and do whatever it takes to win at all costs. And it's like, dude, it's Tuesday.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like just kind of like it's still practice.
Yeah.
It's practice of a different kind.
Mm-hmm.
But like you shouldn't be. You got to know the difference between. It's like Allen Iverson. Like we're talking about practice.
Yeah.
Like you know, there's a difference between the game and practice.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think Dave Tate said something similar way back in the day. Like you only get so many zippy cards, I think he called it.
Yeah.
A month, where it's like you can only go ham maybe 2 or 3 times a month.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just going to be risking some, you know, some burnout problems, just like psychologically, like feeling in the dumps kind of issues, by too much, too often, too soon with guys.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And kind of tugging on that thread of concentration and focus, right? So what role do you think music plays? So obviously lifting weights and training is a skill, like you kind of had mentioned, right? And we have to learn that. So does music kind of take away from that, especially in like a group setting, or do you think that contributes, or what's your thoughts?
You know, I just think that there's a difference between training and learning.
Okay.
And I think that ultimately when you're training, it's like you already know how to do these motions.
Okay.
You've practiced them.
Yeah.
And now it's time to just turn off the conscious brain and work really hard and like, you know, just test physiology at that point. And I think that's a time where music can be very helpful. Like if you've got experienced people, they're doing everything properly, and it's a hard session. Like, yeah, let them enjoy music. I think that there's plenty of studies that show that you're going to get more physiological output with music that you like as compared to no music or music you don't like. But if it's a room full of people that need to learn skills, they're probably going to be distracted with music, and especially if it's too loud and they can't hear anything.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of like, is it teaching or is it training?
Yeah.
And just differentiate between those two things. There's probably a time during every session where it can be just plain old training, where, you know, very low, like barrier of entry kind of exercises, like things you can't screw up, like whether it's like, you know, some kind of miserable sled push protocol, or, you know, just like shuttle runs or something of that kind, where music is not a problem because people don't need to learn a skill. Yeah. But I you know, it really is that separation between like, hey, I need you with me paying attention and trying to learn what I'm telling you, versus, hey, let's just go get it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that has huge implications for like collegiate strength and conditioning. A lot of young strength coaches, you know, they love to blast the music and throw up a video on like Instagram or whatever. But like you said, right, it has to differentiate. Like if these kids need to learn, that's where their resources need to go, not to this music, you know. So I think that's really important to differentiate.
Right, yeah. It's like it's time to learn how to do this hang power snatch, not like, you know, jam out to Drake right now.
Yeah. No, I love it. And so recently you posted a Instagram post, right, on this article you wrote on biosignature. Will you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so, you know, it's funny, like my good friend Ben House, he hit me up last week, and he's like, hey, you know, I've been looking into neurotyping, and there's like not really any evidence on this topic, but a lot of people are like, you know, using it and sort of saying that you can classify people based on like their neurotransmitter profile. Okay. And he was just kind of like, you know, this just sounds ridiculous. Yeah. Because we have no tools to be able to actually measure a human's neurotransmitter concentrations, like really at all. Like you can measure it in rats, like with microdialysis pieces of equipment in live time, but you literally have like, you know, like needles and you're in their brain. Like you have their skull is open and you're directly in their brain.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
Like you obviously can't do this with humans. And so it was kind of like, even if some of these things, these neurotyping concepts are helping people, like, sometimes it's just aggravating when the explanation is so, like, ludicrous. It's like, hey, I appreciate your tool might be helping you, but it's not helping you for the reasons that you're saying it is.
Okay, yeah,
and
yeah.
and it's almost like a bad plan is better than no plan. If I go into a training session and I've selected these garbage exercises, but I've at least timed it out and I know the sequence for how the flow of the session should go, the participants might actually get some benefit from it and enjoy it, this, that, and the other thing, versus things that make a lot of sense from a theoretical standpoint that just logistically aren't organized well or something of that nature. It's really difficult to tease out why things work sometimes, but it's easy to tease out why things don't work. You know what I mean? We know that you cannot measure a human's neurotransmitter levels. So please don't say that you're able to classify humans based on this, because now you're going to have people. What it really comes down to is it's going to be people that are going to try to profit off of this. With some kind of a supplement protocol to be able to target, identify these specific category of humans based on this, and now you're going to be totally bought in. And it's just sort of it's this kind of bait and switch, or we got you hooked on this thing, and now we're gonna run with it sort of deal. So it really that was the primary impetus for him reaching out to me, and I always just love to kind of jump in and see what he's working on, because Ben's a super smart dude and just puts out a lot of really good content. And I've looked at a lot of information over the last few years on the physiology of neurotransmitters and kind of what we know and what might be useful for the world of exercise. So that was really what I tried to touch on, was that knowledge of what the different neurotransmitters are, and kind of the main ones typically being norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, is useful, because you can have a sense of what sorts of just outcomes you have take place when those neurotransmitters bind to receptors in different parts of the brain. And also just kind of because I think that dopamine is a super important neurotransmitter to understand if you're trying to get the most out of people from a fitness standpoint, because dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter, and it's also the neurotransmitter associated with habit formation.
Okay.
So, it really, I don't care what level of fitness you're working in, whether it's, working with senior citizens at a retirement home, pro football players, or general population personal training. It is all habit formation all the time. It's kind of there's plenty of pro athletes that have really terrible dietary lifestyle protocols, and how do I get this person to adopt new behaviors? I really need to understand what causes habit formation to exist and how I can change habit formation in some way, shape, or form. And most of the time it's based on some kind of a cue from the environment or some other person, and then a behavior is initiated. And if you get a reward, you're going to begin to ingrain that behavior as a habit. And Ben at a seminar I taught recently with him, he said something along the lines of our job as fitness and nutrition people, it's not to get people to the point where where they're doing they have to do hard things. You know what I mean? Training has to be hard. Dieting is hard because we live in this culture where you can have whatever you want whenever you want it. So you have to be a strict person. You have to work hard. You have to pay attention. That's hard to do. It's not, our job isn't to get people to do these hard things easier. It's to get them to do these hard things automatically. You There's no thought involved. The only chance you have to get people to be long-term compliant with diet and exercise programs is to make these actions automatic. It's lunch, and I have a salad, I have chicken, I have rice.
Yeah.
Like, bang, that's what you do. And you don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah.
That's just what you do. It's programmed into you. It's completely automatic. It's Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
I go to the weight room at this time.
Yeah.
When I go to the weight room, the first thing that we do is going to be movement prep, and then it's going to be hurdle hops and med ball throws.
Yeah.
It's so automatic for this person. Like, you can see when that changes.
Yeah.
And the only way you can ever really do that is you have to learn how to build in rewards for that person. Because dopamine is released when there is a reward involved, and dopamine reinforces behaviors to the point where they become automatic behaviors. So I think that's just critical. So from this neurotyping standpoint, like, it might tell you, like, oh, this is a serotonin person, this is a norepinephrine person, and it's like, it doesn't matter what kind of person it is. They still need to build habits, and that's still dopamine 10 times out of 10. So don't come at me with any of this other stuff. It's still the same process that we need to engage in. And trying to figure out what the reward is for some people can be tricky. You know what I mean? Like, I try to point out, like, why would anybody be a habitual nail biter? That's kind of an odd thing to have as a habit.
That's a good
point.
But
some people, they like, a lot of people struggle in our society. You don't get a sense of being able to complete anything, and literally just biting all 10 nails can act as a sense of completion. Like, something that you actually can control and finish, and you finished a project. And that is so it's like a lot of these really random things. So, when I think about, like, a lot of good strength coaches have the sheets for the athletes to be able to fill in and then put in the box when they're done or something like that, so they can collect them. Like, literally just finishing your sheet can be an act of reward. But I oftentimes think of, like, being successful with the reps that you're assigned is a reward. Or seeing yourself hit a PR is a reward. So being able to design a program with good periodization, in my opinion, is valuable from a dopamine standpoint.
I like that. Okay.
And also, like, we are, like, dopamine, it's habit formation, and it's also goal related. Like, when you think about, like, dopamine in its truest sense in terms of what it does in the brain, is it creates a level of us being able to move into abstraction.
Okay.
Like other animals are always in the here and the now. They're not capable of imagining themselves at a different time in time overall. Versus humans, where, like, our method of hunting and survival seems to have really driven this as an adaptation in our brains. But as a male hunter, we don't have the physical tools to be able to see an animal, run it down, and kill it with our claws and teeth. What we would have to do would be chase it in the middle of the day in the African heat for a long time. Just wear it down with persistence hunting. But the other animals are still going to be faster than you. So they're going to escape from your immediate presence, and you're going to have to look for signs of where that animal went. You're going to have to look for hoof prints, and you're going to have to look for, like, broken branches and things like that. And if you have a brain that's capable of abstraction, you can think to yourself, you can recognize probably how old that print is, and you can recognize the direction that it's going in. And you can use logic to be able to put these pieces together and have a sense of how much effort it's going to take for you to catch up to that animal. But no other animal is capable of tracking in that same manner. They have to literally smell the thing and have a direction and hear it. They have to use their immediate senses as opposed to this imaginary level of being able to work and separate from time and the here and now.
So in a way, then, this abstraction, this level of thinking is a gift and a curse, right? Because it allows us to do so much more, but then it also takes us away from flow state, which many people are trying to get to, right?
But, I think that ultimately you don't get to flow until you've grinded away for a long time of working towards an imaginary goal.
Okay.
You have to picture what it is that you actually want. And you have to work for a tremendously long time of grinding towards moving towards this goal. And then once you've put in all of that effort and all of that time of mastering something, now when you are in the here and the now of acting out the expression of realizing that goal, you can be in a flow state. But everybody wants flow. And the flow is on the other side of the grind. You don't get to just have it. And you'll never grind for something unless it's a specific goal that you can picture yourself moving towards from a directional state.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. And if I may jump back to a point earlier, right? So you were talking about neurotyping and like the dopamine type. So does this have any relation to, I think, Bondarchuk's earlier writings? He kind of had some neurotyping of like the cholinergic, the phlegmatic, I believe. Is it that similar or is that something different?
I'm not familiar with some of his stuff in that realm.
Oh, okay.
So I really can't speak to it.
Fair enough. And then on a different note, right? So you were talking about habit formation. Do those same steps kind of come into play with skill acquisition?
I think that dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter of motor output.
Okay.
So you really can't separate these things whatsoever. If you're trying to learn a new task, first of all, you would have to explain to somebody why it's important, which is tied to dopamine as well, because like it's an abstract concept. Like you need to be able to shift your weight into this hip and center your weight over this foot. Because it really is symbolic of the backswing of your golf swing. And then all of a sudden this person has this realization like, oh, this is an important thing. Like, I need to be able to be good at this. So dopamine is going to present itself anytime that you're really going to concentrate on something. Like, if I take a bunch of monkeys and I put them in chairs and they have to watch a screen, and at a moment where a specific symbol presents itself on the screen, they hit the button, and if they hit the button, they get grape juice. There's their reward. They don't pay attention in the beginning until they associate hitting the button with the reward of grape juice. And once they realize that there's this reward that can come to them, they are locked in on that screen. They will not leave their chair. They won't go outside and play with the other monkeys. They are completely engaged in this thing. So it's the same thing if you want to teach a skill to an athlete. You have to give them a reason why this skill acquisition is important. And this is true of anything. Like, aside from like basically babies learning how to, crawl, sit, stand, walk, but they're doing it because they're trying to interact with adult humans, which is a reward in and of itself. Like, they're intrinsically motivated by being able to be part of the community. So you don't even have to say anything to them. But everything motor is ultimately driven by some kind of a reward or punishment mechanism. And avoiding a punishment is a reward in and of itself. So it really is like, the more you get into this stuff, you realize like dopamine's kind of the show when it comes to movement. And you better figure out how to build in rewards. And also the abstraction and storytelling to me are critical elements. And I think that great coaches are oftentimes the best storytellers because they give you the backstory, they give you the history of what it is that you're engaging in. They give you something very specific that's like what you're striving towards. They bring you together through this. Like, humans, like we really did evolve around kind of like campfires and engaging with each other's and learning like, values and ethics and morals through storytelling, and eventually, we record our history through storytelling. We are storytelling apes. And if you can't engage with others through that means, you're going to struggle with being able to get them to work towards a task. And the greater the buy-in, probably the better the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. No, I like that. And so diving a little bit more into adaptation, right? So we kind of touched on focus a little bit earlier, but can weak athletes be the result of like a sensory overload, right? So obviously, or sensory underload in that aspect, because obviously with shoes and socks, right, we're taken away from that separation. We're separated from the world in that aspect, as well as having all this technology and constant distractions can disrupt our normal hormonal secretions. So can this stuff kind of be a cause for weak athletes, or what are your thoughts here?
It's a really good question. This to me reminds me of like separations between disease and pathology and normalcy.
Okay.
And, in some ways, like, you can think of this, like I've heard, a lot of guys that are super smart in the realm of like blood panels.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And hormones.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of like, once you're within the normalcy windows of most of your hormones, like moving them up or down doesn't do much of anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It has to be just like good enough and in the window.
Yeah.
It can't be completely negligent, or now you kind of have a pathology.
Yeah.
So when I think of like sensory based stuff, it's kind of like when there's pathology or like disease state, like a spasticity related condition that typically involves some kind of a brain lesion. These are the realms that, like, if you think about like the Czech Republic and some of those great physical therapists, Yanda, and like Germany with Václav Vojta, who worked with babies, and Pavel Kolaj. Like a lot of those guys, they worked with people that have these cerebral palsy or other spasticity related conditions, particularly as children. And what you see with those conditions is that there's oftentimes a lack of afferent flow going back to the central nervous system. And as a result of that, you're not seeing much efferent motor output in those individuals. So if I'm able to drive more sensory information into them, I oftentimes see this dramatic change in muscle tone and the ability to move present itself. And in other areas like the neuroplasticity studies and like the books by Norman Deutsch, The Brain's that Changes Itself and the Brain's Way of Healing. Again, like you'll get these situations where you hear these amazing stories about people with different medical conditions, and like the Pons machine, for instance, in the Brain's Way of Healing, that attaches to the tongue and sends afferent information to the brainstem. And then the brainstem basically connects to every other part of the brain, but it kind of ramps up brain activity everywhere. And you see people that have these, serious movement disorders being able to move normally after using that. And then, of course, like we hear that kind of stuff is like, well, if it works for this person that had a vestibular disorder, what if I attach it to like LeBron James? Will he jump like 8 feet instead of 3.5 or whatever? And I don't think we necessarily know at this point in time. But I think that what we're probably going to find is that it's a lot like parenting, where it just needs to be good enough. Perfect doesn't actually lead you. It's not even better. Not only is it not better, sometimes it can be worse. So there's probably just this realm. It's probably like almost like a sigmoidal shaped graph, where once you hit a certain level, it's like on a plateau of sorts. And like ramping up above and beyond that could be interesting from like a novel sensory experience, but it might not lead to any actual differences in output. But I think that sometimes you will see like certain athletes, like sometimes you just see them like they just don't have like the best shaped bodies or something like that. Like maybe it's like sometimes I think of like almost like a women's basketball center, where it'll just be like a a girl that's able to dominate by her size, but she doesn't necessarily like move all that well. Maybe the knees collapse in. And, you know, you just see kind of funky stuff that you don't like. And for somebody like that, it might be a situation where if you can put in orthotic in a shoe, boom, all of a sudden you see like some dramatic differences. And, you know, so like not all athletes are created equal, and some athletes aren't even very athletic when you get down to it. They're
unfortunately,
just you know, they can just be skilled at this activity and sort of know how to put their body in the right place at the right time, and they've just like learned how to play their game. But you know, so it is tricky. Where I would say, for the most part, they probably are good enough. But there's, you know, certainly the ones that continue to just get hurt over and over again, like the really fragile ones. They might need a little help, and certainly when you have like actual structural issues. And a lot of times, like, you know, you'll just know it when you see it. You might not even know why it's grossly not what you like. But I would say, generally speaking, the body types that are probably going to need a little bit more help will be the ones that have fairly narrow shoulders that are kind of sloped. And then they're like wider in the hips than they are in the shoulder. And then their knees are narrower than their hips. You know, those are kind of like the classical sorts of bodies that just don't really like accept, they don't absorb forces like with dealing with gravity as fluidly and as effectively as, it's kind of like your tornado shaped torso, where you've got kind of like the wide shoulders and the narrow hips, and also just, you know, kind of similar in terms of like thigh and calf shape as well. You know, those are just shapes where they're able to funnel pressures and forces more effectively. Like when you think about jumping up, you have to first move down. And when you move down, you have to deal with and accept gravity, but you also have to deal with and accept the movement of all the fluid and the guts in your torso. And you know, if it's wider at the bottom than it is at the top, it's like a sloshing experience when all those guts and fluids hit the bottom of the pelvis. You know, it's not like it's not like hitting a tight trampoline, like sending it down into a tight drum and having it rebound back up. Instead, it just kind of goes down and sloshes to the sides. You know, so it's the same thing with a flat foot. You know, it's like a foot with a normal arch to it is a foot that is a tight drum. Like it moves down and it's able to kind of like act elastically against the ground rather than just kind of like this, you know, flaccid sort of like weak, you know, non-force accepting pudding.
No, that makes sense. And I mean, that's really interesting, because two of the things that humans do most, right? We walk and we take multiple breaths, right, throughout the day. That's two of the things that are high in nature. So if someone comes to us in training and say has a structural issue, right, or a gait issue or a breathing issue, is there anything that we can do for them as practitioners, or do we just refer out, or how can we help them best in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think that like you know, that's again a really good question that is difficult to like just audibly answer when you don't have like a body in front of you.
No, that makes sense.
You know, I am a big proponent of table tests for just standardized range of motion of joints of the human organism. You know, like, because that tells you a lot, like just passive movement of joints, and oftentimes like you'll get a situation where there's a deficiency, like this person doesn't have enough humeral flexion. And oh, by the way, this person like plays volleyball, so you know they're going to have to like, you know, do some extraneous movement through their torso and their pelvis to be able to get their arm into the right position to strike from, to be able to hit a spike. And over time, that's probably going to be a problem. Wouldn't it be nice if this person just had more humeral flexion? And then it's kind of like, you know, I have kind of like my algorithm that I use with different, you know, segments. Like I generally test the movement of arms and femurs, and I begin to form a picture of the position and shape of the pelvis and the thorax.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I'm gaining a window into the shape and organization of the thorax through the movements that the arm is capable of going through.
Yeah.
And I'm gaining a window into the shape and orientation of the pelvis through the movements that the femur is going through.
Mm.
So, like as an example, a humerus that's unable to demonstrate appropriate amounts of flexion, horizontal adduction,
mm-hmm.
So like crossing the midline of the body,
yeah,
and also possessing like internal rotation of the humerus. I begin to start forming a hypothesis about what I believe the thorax shape is.
Mm-hmm.
Like from what I've seen, the ability of the humerus to internally or externally rotate seems to be highly related to the position that the sternum is in from an inhalation and an exhalation related function. Like when the humerus is unable to internally rotate,
mm-hmm.
I start thinking that the sternum is probably in a pump handle down position.
Okay, so this is like infrasternal angle type stuff?
This is just the position of the sternum itself.
Okay.
Because the sternum bone moves during breathing.
Uh-huh.
Like, we typically talk about the sternum as behaving like a pump handle.
Yeah.
And that pump handle up
yeah.
would be the inhale position.
Yeah.
Where the most inferior part of the sternum is elevating and moving anteriorly if you're standing.
Yeah.
And a pump handle down would be the exhalation position.
Okay.
All right? So if I see no internal rotation of the humerus,
yeah.
I'm thinking that this person is stuck in an exhale position of the sternum. Okay.
Yeah.
I would take a look at the infrasternal angle as well, and the infrasternal angle is kind of like it's just the bottom of your rib cage.
Yeah.
Like if I somehow were I'm looking at a corpse and there's no head on the corpse, and it's standing up and I'm looking down into the hole that would be kind of like the clavicle and the first rib wrapping around to the spine and coming around to the sternum in the front, I would call that the inlet of the of the thorax.
Yeah.
And if I'm looking all the way through, the outlet of the thorax would be down where the infrasternal angle is, the bottom of the rib cage versus the top of the rib cage.
Yeah.
And when I'm trying to think about like the bottom of the rib cage, those floating ribs, they can do a lot of funky things, But if they're flared up and away like a bucket handle, which is typically how we talk about the lower ribs behaving during breathing, it's kind of like bucket handle up or flared ribs is an inhale position, and bucket handle down is an exhale position. Or a wide infrasternal angle is an inhale position, and a narrow infrasternal angle is an exhale position. But only of the bottom part of the rib cage. It's kind of like people are trying to rely on one measurement to tell them everything. When in reality, you have a thoracic inlet, the upper rib cage, you have a thoracic outlet, the lower rib cage, and you have a sternum, which is just kind of like the anterior wall of the thorax, and you have a spine, a thoracic spine, which is the posterior wall of the thorax. So you have to begin to form a picture of what is happening at all of those segments: inlet, outlet, anterior wall, posterior wall. And you can classify the shape of those segments based on what phase of the respiratory cycle they're in. The easiest one to do that with is the infrasternal angle, because you can just see it and kind of measure it with your hands. If it's really wide, then you see an inhalation position, infrasternal angle, inhalation oriented thoracic outlet. Then you can start thinking about what muscles do I need to engage to be able to take an inhale oriented thoracic outlet and be able to change it to an exhale-oriented thoracic outlet. Because I just want to see the thing can change. If it can't change, now I need to refer out. Okay, that's really what this comes down to really get back to your question. If I know my anatomy well enough, I can start actually utilizing very specific exercises and breathing techniques to be able to change these things. If my interventions don't work, and I've literally tried everything, now I need to start thinking about other professionals that I send this person to.
Okay. No, that's a good point, yeah.
If I'm dealing with someone that is stuck in a wide infrasternal angle, inhalation-oriented thoracic outlet, I know that this person is not utilizing strong exhalation mechanics. And I'm going to engage a powerful exhalation that would be utilizing pressure and force so that I can recruit the external oblique. And the external oblique is going to close the infrasternal angle and make it more narrow. You know, if I see someone that's got this incredibly narrow infrasternal angle, I'm going to try to get that person to learn how to exhale without really driving a tremendous amount of force and pressure.
Okay. Yeah.
You know? Now, when I start thinking about somebody that maybe can't flex a humerus and can't horizontally adduct a humerus, I start thinking about the shape of the thoracic inlet.
Okay.
And, you know, if somebody can't flex a humerus and they can't horizontally adduct a humerus, it really, like, if you were strict in terms of saying, well, this is actually a scapular problem, like, you know, horizontal adduction of a humerus would require the scapula to be able to abduct. It needs to be able to move away from the spine. And like in Shirley Simon's textbook, it needs to be able to reach the mid-axillary line for that to be able to happen. That's full abduction of a scapula. And humeral flexion requires upward rotation of a scapula. If the scapula can't upwardly rotate, then you're not going to be able to achieve maximal humeral flexion. And so you're saying, okay, well, it's a scapular problem, you know? And I would just say that, like, what I'm trying to do is take it one step farther and say, I don't know if I have a scapular problem yet. I don't know, because I need to think about this from the perspective of the rib cage. Now, you know, ribs go from the spine and they wrap around the side of the body and they attach, the upper ribs attached to the sternum itself. Now, what can happen is and they should have a degree of curve, obviously. Like we should be kind of a barrel-shaped thorax in some ways. But what happens if I compress the organism front to back? The sternum is in fact in an exhale position. I don't have internal rotation. It's probably in an exhale position. And I see also that, like, the thoracic spine is pretty flat. Like, I'm essentially crushing you inwards in terms of your anterior and your posterior walls moving towards each other. And if I'm crushing you inwards, I'm also going to pop you wide from the perspective of just the shape of you. You know what I mean? Like, if I were to squish in on a donut, like, something's got to move someplace. Like, we're mostly made out of water still. So, you know, I'm just starting to think, like, this is probably someone that has a wide upper thorax. You know, their ribs are flat and they're wide. You know, so it's literally that this scapula needs to travel a longer distance across a flatter road. You know, it's like, like the scapula is almost like a car that's driving over a road, and that road is the rib cage. It should be a sloped, curved road that has a short distance to be able to go from the back to the front. But what if that road is flattened out and it's elongated from a lateral standpoint, a width standpoint? Now all of a sudden the scapula has to go a mile to try to get around the body and get to that mid-axillary armpit line. You know, it's not the scapula's fault that it can't abduct and upwardly rotate. It's the shape of the rib cage that's preventing the scapula from being able to travel to where it needs to travel to. So what I would need to do, I would need to actually come up with a strategy of being able to take the sides of this rib cage and just crush them together towards each other. And if I do that, I'll pop you forward and backwards from an anterior-posterior perspective. And, you know, so it's kind of like, well, how the hell would I do that? You know what I mean? And I can tell you who suffers from this stuff more than anybody. is typically very well strength trained individuals.
Okay.
And why do they suffer from this? Well, because muscles that would compress you anterior and posteriorly together are things like the muscles in the front and back side of your body, your pecs and your lats more than anything.
Okay.
You know, like what happens when you lift weights? You're actually crushing yourself together from the front and the back.
It's interesting
like
to
you're
think about.
tensioning up.
Yeah.
And just look at the adaptations that take place in the body.
Uh-huh.
Like you get wider. You literally get wider as an organism. And when you start looking at heavily strength-trained people, oftentimes they're not that wide in terms of front-back.
Okay, yeah.
You know, they're getting crushed together front-back with pecs and lats, and they're popping out wide. And it makes sense from the perspective of picking up barbells.
Yeah.
Because the wider you are, the more you're able to have a wider base of support and stabilize your system to be able to move a barbell.
Yeah.
You know? It's the same thing that happens to obese people. They just get wider and wider to deal with load.
That's great. I mean, I've never really thought of it like that, but it makes so much sense when you put it in those terms, you know?
Yeah.
So.
You know, this is stuff I got from Bill Hartman, too.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he really opened my eyes to this entire concept, and I've never heard anybody else really talk about it or explain it the way he has. But I need to, you know, a lot of this stuff will come to powerful reaching exercises and also side lying exercises.
Okay.
Because if I put you on your side, I'm just going to use gravity to bring the sides closer together.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll use a lot of manual techniques with these kind of individuals because I do get a lot of lifters that come to work with me that have like a shoulder problem or something like that. And it's like, okay, I'm just going to like literally put you on your side and I'm going to take all of my weight and crush down on your side.
Yeah.
And you're going to reach your arms forward as hard as you possibly can. Because the serratus anterior is also a muscle that wraps around the side of the rib cage.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of bananas. And if I can engage that thing strong enough with reaching, it will literally compress you in from the two sides.
I mean, I guess that
you a little bit more barrel shaped front back.
No, that just goes back to form dictates function, right? I mean, if you put them in the correct form, then the function will be where you want it to be, right?
That's exactly it.
Okay. No, that's really interesting.
So, you know, it's kind of like, and you know, for a lot of male athletes, you're going to tend to see a little bit more of that. Like, I generally just see like people with limitations in arm movement.
Yeah.
You know, it's some kind of a thoracic issue.
Yeah.
And if I'm able to think about the musculature that changes the form of the rib cage.
Yeah.
And will straighten out spines and crush sternums in and pop a infrasternal angle out.
Yeah.
Because you know that's common. Like you'll see these mismatches. Like, oh, this guy is like, you know, his sternum is in an exhale position. He can't internally rotate his humerus, but his infrasternal angle is super wide, so he's inhaled down there.
Yeah.
I need to get this guy to exhale powerfully and keep those lower ribs in.
Yeah.
While he hits an inhale that expands him in the upper chest, front, back. And sometimes the first time somebody gets a breath like that, they feel like they're suffocating or something like that.
Yeah.
But they feel that expansion, and then you go. You know, I always just rely on testing and retesting and seeing if I'm actually going in the right direction. And you know, most of the time, if you're really accurate with your anatomical appraisal and you nail the technique, you typically see change, and people experience really good outcomes from this stuff. But it's just kind of like, man, I'm glad I know guys like Bill Hartman, because it's like, you know, otherwise you kind of chasing your tail with sort of like activities that aren't specific enough. It's like, you know, he'll give you a scalpel with a laser seeker on it. And it's amazing what something like that can do for you.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. I mean, I'm going to have to do a lot of self study on some of this stuff personally, just because, you know, it's stuff that you're not really exposed to in the day-to-day or in typical academia, you know. So this is really interesting stuff, and I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it as well.
Yeah, it's tough to just try to explain it from an audio perspective. So I try to be as specific as I can and describe it as graphically as I can. Because I think a lot of times it's like we're like walking our way into like speculationville from a science perspective. But, when it really comes down to it, like, all of these things are n equals 1. You have a case study in front of you on a table, and when you see things that are as close to objective measurements change, that's what I try to rely on, and that's the closest thing to empirical processing as I can get to. I generally try to avoid most manual muscle testing because, the research on that stuff is just demonstrating that it's kind of a crapshoot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can change what you as the tester, your perception, interacting with the person that you're working with. Like there's a lot of problems with that, but at least in terms of like standardized joint range of motion testing on a table, that seems to be like stuff that you can't really screw up too much. And if you're changing motion capabilities, chances are, if you're normalizing them, if you're just putting them within human norms, you're going to help that person be able to execute tasks in the aftermath of that they need to be able to do with better biomechanics.
Okay.
I've kind of said that if you can clear the table, you have the ability to enter motor learning 101.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you know how to do anything properly, but you've got a chance now,
Yeah.
So it's like I've tried to explain this to people like that think that like there's like magic buttons and now all of a sudden the person's going to be like perfect at these activities.
Yeah.
I'm like, the population that would do the best on the table is probably like 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
But watch 4-year-olds try to do sports skills. They're terrible. Like they're the worst. They're the worst population there is. But they can learn how to do them at a tremendous rate.
Yeah.
Because they have the potential. But they still have to learn and work.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's super funny when you put it like that, right? It makes so much sense. But no, I love it, and I think this has been great. But we're kind of getting close on time here, so just moving in kind of this last segment, right? Do you think that more strength coaches or more people in the strength and conditioning setting can benefit from pursuing higher education, such as like doctorates or things like that, in either exercise science or a related field?
It's tricky. I feel like this is one of those ones that puts me on the spot. And I would say that like I don't know if I sometimes people are like, well, I get strange requests sometimes from people. In my opinion, strange because people are like, can I mentor under you?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I don't know, man. Like I'm kind of a weirdo to tell you the truth. Like,
yeah.
I don't know how I've landed where I have. It's funny, kind of like in looking, like I was raised mostly by an aunt who took care of me as a kid, and she's kind of an eccentric person, and like, but she, her business is she's a dog breeder, and I've kind of just watched her, like she's reshaped her career a number of times. She originally started as a lawyer, and worked as a nurse, and then sold antiques on eBay, and now she breeds and sells dogs.
Yeah.
And she's got this amazing following in her world.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, I'm trying to picture like, as a kid, kind of watching her go through this process. How the hell would she ever mentor somebody?
Yeah.
Like, she kind of is able to do what she does because she's her. And she just has this kind of weird ability to like bring people into her community.
Yeah.
And it's funny when you become an adult and you realize like that you're somewhat like your parents.
Yeah.
And I sort of see myself like, man, how the hell have I kind of adopted some of the things that she like? I've kind of done something similar in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, is it because I had a PhD? Or is it because of any of these other things? And in some ways, I don't think so. I think that it's just like, you're gonna end up doing what you're going to do, or you're gonna be yourself in some way, shape, or form. So knowing how to direct people into these things, or telling them what level of education they need to be able to reach is really tricky.
Yeah.
And I think especially in the fitness industry, in some ways I feel like I'm pretty lucky to be in New York City because I get to see some of the wildest stuff you could ever imagine taking place in the fitness spectrum. You know, and the majority of people that I see being financially successful are not the most educated people. You know, they're, in all honesty, they're the people that are the best looking and the most fun to hang around. You know, and I don't know if that's necessarily like not the case at other levels too. Like at a certain point, you just have to really know how to engage with other humans and be a fun person to hang around. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that you're going to acquire as a result of pursuing academics. And in some cases, I think that can throw you in the wrong direction. Okay. Because now you're just kind of a nerd. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like I you know, one of the trainers at Peak Performance where I started in the city, he's one of the most successful trainers in New York City. I remember him saying to me early on, you know, he's like, you know, your clients, not only are they not going to care about how smart you are, they don't even want you to be smart. They want you to be cool. Like, he's like, do you want to go out on a date with a really smart person? Or do you want to go out on a date with a really cool person? And I was like, well, for me, he's like, no, don't even think about it for you. Like, he's like, everybody likes being around cool people. And these, like, you know, so it's sort of like, if you don't have those human engagement elements, you're in a tough field. Because on a day in and day out basis, whatever level you're at, like if you want to walk into an NFL locker room and be a dork with a PhD, you're never going to get like any kind of buy-in from those guys. They're going to chew you up and spit you out. You know, and like it's same thing. It would be true, I would say, on the private sector. You could be the smartest person in the world. You're going to be super poor if you don't know how to just hang out with people and tell a good story and listen and tell jokes. But if you want to be an academic and do research, well, you got to go for it. You know, it took me a long time to realize, like, well, for what I'm doing, I'm super overeducated, and I don't really need any of the credentials that I have, but I just like to learn. You know, and my weird kind of niche in the industry, like, you know, like half of my career in terms of finances is educating other fitness professionals. You know, so I needed to have that other side in terms of learning pedagogy and learning science at like a certain level to be able to have that as something that's kind of in my wheelhouse. But, you know, maybe in the pro sector, you need to be like, at this point in time, like so many of these guys are like Excel sheet guys. And, you know, like your job at this point is to be able to read the Excel sheet and know what the GPS data says, and, you know, manage training volume, and if you don't know Tim Gabbett stuff, then there's like no place for you in the NBA. So it's just really one of those hard questions in terms of like, and again, like this for me is like, I didn't know where I wanted to work when I got into this field. I bumped around and kind of landed someplace. But that's an unlikely story to actually be successful. So I would say, like, if people have an idea of where it is that they want to end up, that should help them in terms of deciding upon how much continuing education in terms of like graduate degrees they would really need to be able to land in something like that.
Okay. No, I think that's a really good answer. Awesome. I mean, this has been fantastic. And so my last question for you would just kind of be, what projects are you currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
So right now, like the main thing I'm working on is there's a whole bunch of us in my little world they're heading down to Texas in November, and we're all competing against each other in this strength challenge that Ben House put together. So I think there's going to be like 30 dudes working in the industry that are going to hang out at this place near San Antonio, and like, we're going to go down there and just have a throwdown in the weight room.
Yeah.
So I've like been so locked in on training for that it's like I haven't been writing or doing anything because it's just like I don't want to travel too much or lose training time.
Yeah.
And that's been fun, man. That's been a lot of fun to get away from just like the constant grind of writing and reading and that whole deal.
Yeah.
But next thing's up for me. I've put together the Rethinking the Big Patterns seminar.
Okay.
And I think I know what I need to do to make that into Rethinking the Big Patterns 2. That'll be like really a nice upgrade and something that'll really help coaches out a lot.
Yeah.
And also I think I'm going to have to write Mass 3 in the next year.
Okay.
Which I'm trying to live through it right now. Because I really, every program I've ever put together, I have to train the thing and kind of test it out myself before I have other people try to do it. So those are the two big ones. And then where people can find information on me is the best source to go to is drpatdavidson.com. That will link to literally everything else. It'll take people to where they can find Rethinking the Big Patterns as a video.
Yeah.
And links to the books and links to every article and podcast I've ever done online.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's great, and I really appreciate your time. This has been hugely eye-opening, you know what I mean? There's a lot of topics that you can dive into for self-study off of this, and so I really thank you for that, and hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to, man. This is a great interview, and I always like talking with people that are in the trenches and really doing this stuff and care, and getting a chance to get in there with a guy on the public sector side versus being on the private sector. My original love was collegiate strength and conditioning. So, always a pleasure.
No, thank you so much. All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right, man. Thank you.
Thanks, Coach. Thanks again for joining me. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please head on over to iTunes and write me a review, as well as give me a 5-star rating. Next week we'll have another exciting guest, but until then, this is the Gamut Performance Podcast.